This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa and today, in place of a draft video, I'm bringing you something a little bit different, though I'll still be talking about Limited. War of the Spark Limited season is almost over, as Core Set 2020 spoiler season is now underway, and we are only a few weeks away from the release of the set, and only about a week and a half away, believe it or not, from my next full set Limited review, which will begin pretty quickly after the set is fully revealed. That means it is time to look back at War of the Spark, now that I've drafted the set more than 50 times, and discuss what I think I got wrong in my set review. Obviously enough, it is impossible to get everything exactly right in a set review, because I do them before getting a chance to play with the set. In this video, I'll be talking about the cards that I was wrong about by more than half a letter grade, and discuss why I think I got the card wrong to begin with. Now let's get started with White, where I think I got two cards wrong. One of them is Bond of Discipline, which I gave a C+ to. So my reasoning for this card was that I imagined it as sort of a white Cosmotronic Wave, a card we've seen in the recent past that was a great finisher for aggressive red decks, and a card that really overperformed, I think. But I think I went a little too far with Bond of Discipline in giving it a C+, which would indicate you play it most of the time in your white decks, which it turns out usually isn't true. I think I've played it a couple of times and it was alright. But what it doesn't have going for it that Cosmotronic Wave does is that the wave can actually kill things in a pinch too, if they're small enough or if you've done damage to them. Bond of Discipline can't really do that. There are board states where it's really great, but there are probably more of them where it doesn't do anything, and for that reason I think it's more like a C-. I don't think it's terrible, but I think you play it a lot less frequently than I expected. Next up is Parhelion 2. This thing I gave a D+ to, my reasoning being that it was incredibly expensive, seemed way too hard to make work, crew 4 is a ton, and if you don't have a way to crew it when you play it, which isn't something that is crazy to say, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And while I think all of that is true, this format turned out to be slow enough, and there turned out to be enough ramp, especially in green, that I think Parhelion 2 is actually pretty solid, and that you do play it a reasonable amount of the time. You do need to end up with all of that ramp to make it work. You also have to make sure you have enough creatures with 4 or more power. You can obviously do it with more than one creature if you have to, but ideally you're crewing with only one creature. And all of that means I think it's actually a solid playable in the right deck. I think some people still really overrate it. I've had people tell me they think I should first pick it, and I don't think that's right at all. I've drafted it before and then not played it just because I didn't end up with enough ramp. And if you don't end up with enough ramp, you can't play it because it's so expensive. Right now let's move to blue, where I got a bunch of cards wrong. First up is Contentious Plan, which I gave a D2 in your typical limited deck and a C- as a build-around grade, in a deck that really wanted to proliferate. So I think my mistake here is, and it's one we're going to see continue on this list, is that I think I underestimated proliferate and just how many counters are around, which is something many of you said in the set review, the comments for the set review, and I think you guys were right. In the end, pretty much every blue deck wants to be proliferating or it wants to be casting spells, and Contentious Plan does both of those things. There are just so many +1/+1 counters in this set, so many loyalty counters, that a card that says draw a card proliferate is actually quite good. In a lot of ways it just cycles, but it isn't unusual for this to say put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, draw a card, and for 2 mana that's a pretty good deal even at sorcery speed. So in the end I think it's more like a C in your typical blue deck, and maybe it gets a little bit of a bump in a deck with a lot of proliferate and gets bumped up to a C+. It's not an incredible card, it's not one I was wildly wrong about, but it is a blue card that you play a significant percentage of the time, and sometimes it's a really good card for your deck. Next up is Flux Channeler. Similar problem here. I gave it a D as a baseline grade and a C+ build around. I think now it's much better than that. I do think this card is highly overrated by people, I will say. I think a lot of people think it's just incredible all the time in your blue deck, and that's just not the case. It does still get a build around grade, and it still has a baseline grade. For me, I think it's a C in your typical blue deck and a B in a deck that can really take advantage of it. The thing that you need to have is both spells and +1/+1 counters, and granted that is a doable thing. There are a bunch of blue cards that make armies, for example, and this synergizes really well with those. It's a spell and it puts a +1/+1 counter on something or makes a creature with a +1/+1 counter. However, it has horrible stats, it's easy to kill, and there are just going to be times where you play it and you just can't do anything with it, especially in like your average blue deck, which is where I think it's a C. I do think it has a really high ceiling, and I think in some weak packs you should first pick it, but I've had people tell me that I should be snap first picking it, and I just don't see that being the case in the majority of packs. And that's why I think it's overrated. I think some people think it's like one of the best uncommons in the set, And I don't think it quite gets there just because it's still so build-aroundy, even in a set loaded with +1/+1 counters. Next up is Kaz Mina's Transmutation, and this is one a lot of people got wrong. I gave it a B-, which means it's sort of lower range premium removal, something you should consider first picking. I did say, specifically, in my video that, this is horrible against army tokens, and this is horrible about +1/+1 counters, but I said, it's still going to be good against a wide majority of the field. And that's kind of true, but I think it turns out there are, again, so many +1/+1 counters and so many armies that there are a lot of times where playing the Transmutation does nothing or does very little. Now, it's not an unplayable card, it's just not premium removal by any stretch, and you shouldn't consider first picking it ever. And in fact, I don't usually feel good about running more than one of these in my main board. Having a second one in my sideboard is nice because against some opponents, it does do some serious work, but it's going to be a dead card, or at least a card that does very little because of all the +1/+1 counters and armies running around too much of the time for you to consider it premium at all. I think it's just a solid C. Next up is Theater Strix, a card I gave a baseline grade to as well as a build around. I gave it a D- in your typical blue deck and a C- in a deck that could really get it triggered a lot. And again, here I think the mistake I made is that this is an evasive creature, even in a world where you don't have that many instants or sorceries, or non-creature spells actually more generally, to get Theater Strix a +1/+0 every turn. It's still a great place to put +1/+1 counters, and it is really good against planeswalkers because it's an evasive source of damage. It can pressure planeswalkers early, and that's an important thing to have in this set. In the end, I don't think this really needs a build-around grade. I think either between having a bunch of non-creature spells and or +1/+1 counter things in your deck, Theater Strix is going to be a solid playable. I think it's just a solid C in every blue deck. Next up is Relentless Advance, which I gave a D to. Now, my reasoning here, which I think was faulty reasoning, now, obviously enough, was I looked at it as a 4-mana 3/3, and that's obviously not very good. Granted, I think I gave it a little bit of a bump because a 4-mana 3/3 vanilla would probably be like a D-, so I gave it a D. But again, I think I underestimated +1/+1 counters. It's very easy to make this count for more than 3 counters pretty quickly because you can proliferate. Additionally, if you already have an army in play, it is sort of like adding 3 power to the board with haste, and that is some nice extra bonus. Finally, it works really well in the blue-red deck because it both likes +1/+1 counters because it makes a creature and it's a spell. And I think all of this makes this card obviously still not a great one, still one that you probably hope you're not playing more than one copy of, but it's certainly not a D. It's certainly just a solid card. I think it's more like a C-. So yeah, that's blue. Wrong about a lot there. Almost all of it related to +1/+1 counters. Now let's move to black. First up is Bolus Citadel, which I gave a C. This is another card that I think people overrate. However, I certainly underrated it in my initial set review. My reasoning was, it has a difficult casting cost, and if you're low on life, it's not going to be very useful. Those two things are still true, obviously enough, but the ceiling this card has is even higher than I imagined. If you play this when you're at, let's say, 15 life, maybe even 10 life, most of the time you're just going to win the game because it lets you cast at least 2 extra spells, lets you hit some extra land drops off the top. You're almost never going to get to sacrifice 10 non-land permanents. That effect isn't going to happen very often unless you play it when you're at like 20, I guess. But it is going to give you some serious card advantage. And for that reason, I do think it's first pickable in some weaker packs. I don't think it's a full-blown bomb. It can feel that way sometimes, but the fact that I have sometimes on the end there tells you that it's not a bomb. A bomb is a card that is always good, basically. Bolus' Citadel just isn't. I've had people beat me with it, but I've also beaten people with it, or had opponents have it stranded in their hand when they're at low life and just can't do anything with it. And those are both very reasonable things to happen with it. But I do think it's a B-. Its ceiling is high enough that it is worth first picking sometimes, and it's certainly not a C. Next up, we have Lassiter Beaver, and this is one when I look back at, and I'm like, why did I give this a C-? Seriously? For a lot of the amass cards, I think I actually did a pretty good job. The creatures that make tokens, for the most part, I think I did a good job. I don't know why I gave Lassiter Beaver a C-. It's really hard for me to understand how I did it. I think it's obviously just a huge mistake because if this were either a 2-mana 1/2 that makes a 1/1, or a 2-mana 1/2 that puts a +1/+1 counter on something, which is the two options that it's going to be, granted you have to put the counter in one specific place, but either of those options is a pretty good limited card in any format. And that's how I thought about most of these, so again, I'm not really sure how I screwed this up. But Lassiter Beaver is actually a high-quality black common, one of the best ones around. I think it's more like a C+. You play, usually, as many of them as you get. It synergizes well with Sacrifice. It synergizes well with Proliferate. It's a really great 2-drop in the format. Now let's move to red, where I think I only got one card wrong, and it's Thibault Rakish Instigator. There is our first Planeswalker. There are several of them to come that I think I got wrong, which I think is a reasonable thing to do. You know, these Planeswalkers are hard to judge. They're different than any ones we've ever seen before. And as a result, I think I was wrong. I think 5 or 6 of them are on this video out of the 18 or so cards. So makes sense that I got them wrong. I think a lot of people did. And I certainly got Thibault wrong when I gave him a C. While Thibault's static ability is completely irrelevant most of the time, sometimes it comes up, but the real value comes from the fact of Thibault's Devil tokens. They're just really strong. Frequently, if you play them on turn 3, you're just going to get those 2 bodies, and they can clog up the board in a way you can't even imagine, just because so many opponents have X1s in play, and they don't want to attack into them and lose their X1 and maybe lose something else in combat. He creates difficult board states, and he's only 3 mana. I think I shied away from thinking about him as a 3 mana sorcery, let's say, that has rebound and gives you a 1/1 devil each turn, which is kind of what he amounts to. I didn't think you'd be able to do that consistently enough because he'd be pressured, but that was kind of stupid of me because the devil tokens themselves actually protect him on a lot of board states, so you usually get both devils, and anytime you do, he's pretty good. In the end, I think Thibault is a first pickable uncommon, one of the better red uncommons, and I think he's more like a B-. In green, I missed on 1 card, I think, and it's a pretty boring one, so we'll be quick. It's Primordial Worm, which has a 6 mana 7/6. I thought, hey, you know, that's decent stats, that's a C. You'll play it in your green deck sometimes. Turns out not so much. I don't know if I've ever played one. I've had a few people play them against me. Their complete lack of evasion makes them pretty uninteresting. There's not a lot you can do with them. Sure, they attack kind of okay, but they're just way better green monsters in this set at lower or similar mana costs. And in the end, that means this is a D. It means you almost never play it, but it is reasonable to put into your deck. Right, now let's move to multicolored, where I got a lot of things wrong, primarily Planeswalkers. So first up, I gave Raw Storm Conduit a C+. I thought he would be a little bit hard to build around. I loved the idea of that he could sort of go off and make you all of these copies of spells. His static ability lets you damage things. I love Scry 1. You know, he starts with 6 loyalty, essentially. Those are all really great things. But I thought he'd be hard to build around for one reason or another. I think I definitely should have given him a higher grade. Obviously, Blue-Red is a spell deck, so I should have really taken that into account. But I also think this set has a higher number of spells than normal that you can shove into your deck because of all the ones that have Amass. Callous Dismissal, the fact that it's a spell but also gives you a creature, means that you can play it and feel a little safer about a low creature count because it at least adds to your board in a way most spells just don't. And blue and red both have several cards with Amass that work this way that you can double with Rawl, and they're pretty great because he gets a token to protect himself, he copies your spell, bounce 2 things, so on and so forth. Overall, I think Rawl's really, really good, and I think he's a solid first pick. I think he's a solid B, certainly not a C+. Next up, I have Tamayo, Collector of Tales. So she's another one whose static ability almost never comes up. There are some exceptions, but almost never comes up. And I think I can understand really how I got her wrong. I think this one's sort of an understandable one that I got wrong because I didn't like the idea that she starts, you know, with 5 loyalty, and that's nice, but that she has a +1 where you have to name the right card to get a card into your hand. I get it. You loading up your graveyard with that -3, and then maybe you can get them back. But you're going to miss a significant chunk of the time on that +1. This was my rationale. Well, there are a few things that I think made her better than I expected. One of them is that there's plenty of scry in this set. It makes it easier to hit things with the +1. It's also not unusual to end up with 3 or 4 copies of cards in this set. She can hit that more likely with her +1. On top of that, sometimes you can just play her -3 her, get something back from your graveyard, and then proliferate. Then she gets back up to 3 loyalty, and you can do it again. Anytime you can get 2 things back from your graveyard with her, and this is what I said in my set review, you're going to feel pretty great about her, but I just didn't think you'd be able to do it consistently enough. But it turns out you can, thanks to Proliferate. You can play her -3, proliferate, -3 again, and then you're in really good shape. Overall, I gave her a C last time. I think she's more like a B-. I don't think she's like an incredible first pick, but it is nice you can splash her easily in green decks. That's something I've done a few times and been pretty happy about. Next up is Angrath, Captain of Chaos, another Planeswalker. So with Angrath, I think I overrated both things that he does. I love Menace, but, it's not the best evasive ability. But in this format, where evasion is sort of at a premium because you need to pressure your opponent's Planeswalkers, it's even better than I think it usually is. On top of that, the fact that he can amass 2 is pretty nice. I think I just, again, underrated how easy it would be to use his ability twice, because when I talked about him in my set review, I said, you know, if you can pay 4 and get a 4/4 and give all your creatures menace with this, or 4 and get 2/2/2s, depending on what's going on the board, you're going to feel pretty good. But I didn't think he'd be able to do it consistently enough. But again, he can actually protect himself with his own ability, so I think I really underrated him. I didn't think he was terrible or anything. I gave him a C. I thought he'd be solid, and you'd play him most of the time in black and red decks. But he's more like a B-. I think he's a lower range first pickable kind of card. Next up is Dovan, another Planeswalker. So Dovan I gave a D to. I just thought his ability to, stop one of your opponent's creatures wouldn't matter enough of the time. And I also didn't like that his static ability only hits 3 different kinds of spells that are the least common kind of spell, really, in this format. Creatures and Planeswalkers aren't there. Would have been interesting if he had Planeswalkers added to it. But both of these abilities proved to be stronger than I expected them to be. For one thing, he's sort of like a bad Icy Manipulator in the sense that he can shut down your opponent's best creature. He doesn't shut it down completely like Icy Manipulator, hence the bad part, because he doesn't make it so you can attack through it. If you use his ability and attack into a thing that you just made it so it can't do damage, it's not going to be as easy to attack through as with something like Icy Manipulator that taps it. But there are enough times where shutting down your opponent's best evasive creature means that Dovan can't be pressured, and if you have other Planeswalkers, it can kind of snowball. You have other Planeswalkers who now can't be pressured either, and the game can kind of get out of control. There are just a lot of control decks. You take this and combine it with Ashiok, where those two sort of work together and just kill the opponent before they're ever able to do lethal damage. And that wasn't really something I expected. I didn't think Dovan would do stuff most of the time. And I do still think he's another card that people overrate. There are a significant number of board states where he does nothing. If your opponent has gone wide on you and you're behind on board, he's not really going to matter. But if you're at parity or you're ahead, he's at least decent, and I think he's more like a C rather than a D. Now let's move to the last 2 cards I got wrong, which are artifacts. One of them is Iron Bully, which I gave a D+ to. And this is another card that a lot of people in the comments for my set review said, I think you're wrong. There's a lot of Proliferate in this set. He's going to be way better than he looks. And I was like, well, whatever. I think it's a D+. Well, I was wrong. So in the end, Proliferate is a big deal in this set. And Iron Bully definitely gets a boost in power as a result of the presence of Proliferate. He's also got Menace. We've already talked about how Evasion is even better in this set than in most, because sometimes you really need to kill those Planeswalkers before they get out of hand. But, the fact he puts a counter on the battlefield and a body on the battlefield works really well with Proliferate, and Proliferate is one of the key aspects of this entire set. All that said, I'm not saying he's incredible or you should first pick him or anything even close to that, but a D+ means you're not going to play him most of the time, and in reality, I think in a lot of decks with Proliferate, you play him a decent chunk of the time, maybe more often than you don't. I think he's more like a C. And our last card I got wrong is Healy's Silverwing. This is the one that I was wrong about that probably surprised me the most. I gave it a D, and I can definitely understand how I did that. This isn't one I look back at and I'm like, how could I have thought this? Because a 4-mana 2/3 with flying that lets you look at the top card of your opponent's library, not so good in most formats. But there are 2 things that make this better than it usually is, and they're things we've already mentioned. One of them is that it's a good place to put counters. And the other part is related to that. It also has evasion, meaning it can pressure Planeswalkers. Additionally, getting to see the top card of your opponent's library on top of a creature that in this format at least is reasonably playable and efficient doesn't hurt. I mean, that information is sometimes very useful. There have been times where I get to see that my opponent has a no escape, and that's been nice. Granted, there are also times where I see a land and my opponent just plays it right away. It's probably not a meaningful into the battlefield trigger more than it isn't. But, I mean, I've found myself in decks that are just loaded up with removal where I need a win condition and I have like 3 Healy Silverwings because that's all I could get. And they do the job. You put +1/+1 counters on them, you kill anything that gets in their way, and so Healy Silverwings can do it. I mean, they're nothing special, certainly. And I still don't think they're great. I think you cut them more often than you don't, but I think they're a C- and not a D, which I think is a significant difference. Well, that does it. Those are all the cards I was wrong about in War of the Spark. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to make sure you catch future content, including the soon-to-come Core Set 2020 set review, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.